Excellent. All right, Jacob, thank you so very much. Welcome, everyone, once again. This is the 5th class in the series this summer. As Kristen just said, we've got a 6th class, and then we'll be back in some other iteration down the road. Blue Sky never, ever sleeps, and nor do any of us, right? So tonight we're going to talk all about the First Amendment. Once again, you may recall that in the past we chatted about some of the aspects of it. Tonight we're going to be talking about freedom of the press and of the capacity of our media. And we've got, as Kristen just said, between Kyle and David, wonderful guests who are going to talk with us about some of the challenges right up front and identify some of the issues related to misinformation and fake news, those kinds of things, the things we can do. And I'm going to start that, Jacob, with the next slide with a little bit of introduction. So you can go to the next one after that. Simply reminding us all of what James Madison said in 1787, 1789. You see that portion of the First Amendment that talks about how the Congress, meaning the government, will not do anything to abridge the freedom of speech or of the press. And that's going to be our focus tonight. So Jacob, next slide. One of the things that both Kyle and David will talk with you about are the reasons why we have good journalists and we've got responsible journalism. And then we also have the opposite side of that. And we chatted right before we started tonight. It turns out that Kyle and David will tell you from their perspective about 4 core reasons why we have journalism focuses out there among our reporters that are good and decent and right. Needless to say, when lawyers get a hold of 4 things, we do what? We expand it into 6. And so I've got 6 of them, but they're going to parallel very much what Kyle and what David are going to tell you about in just a moment or so. I'm going to be very brief on all this because you're going to hear from them in greater length in just a moment or so. Reasons why we need responsible journalism and the things that journalists should be focused upon. Accuracy and truthfulness, we know all about that, reliable sources, checking information, fairness, impartiality, ensuring that we are not engaging in intentional bias, we're not distorting the truth, independence, we don't want to be affected by sources outside of our own integrity, and the focuses that we have, ensuring again that service to the public is paramount. Jacob, next slide. We also have 3 other things, accountability, and again, our guests tonight are going to talk a lot about that, ensuring transparency about sources. When there are mistakes that are made, they're going to discuss, I suspect, not only intentional things, but also some mistakes that have been made out there, that we're mindful enough that we correct those along the way. Ultimate focus on public and community interests, addressing not only what happened, but why those things mattered. And then, again, all of these much related professionalism and sensitivity, highest levels of conduct and appropriateness when it comes to ethical codes, considering the impact on our community generally. That is all the positive kinds of things that we think about when we focus upon journalists and the role of reporting today. Again, following up on Kristen's good introductions of our guest, I am now going to turn this over to Kyle and David. We're going to tell us all about some of the ways in which we are challenged today in those principles. And then, as Kristen said at the very end of their presentation, I'm going to come back to tell you more about some of the legal aspects of this, including some constitutional cases that are out there in history and our recent challenges. We're going to talk about 4 of them, believe it or not, only 4 of them that in very significant ways are the bookends to what Kyle and David are going to talk with you about tonight. With that, I'm pleased to introduce to you once again Kyle and David, who are here to tell us all about the significant challenges that we do have. And Jacob, let's go to the next slide. All right, gentlemen, go ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's good to be in community and company with y'all. And so really happy to be able to go through and talk a little bit about what democracy means in relation to the media and what the media's role in democracy is, because they play in a very, very important role. Next slide, please. So these are just some community agreements. I don't think much of these apply because we're not doing too much interaction. We'll take questions, but this is meant for when we're doing some vibrant workshops and whatnot. So we can go to the next slide. And this is a little bit about our team. You know myself, you know David, you've heard a little bit about us, but we have 2 other wonderful folks that are also a part of the All In team. Kristen spoke a little bit to Dr. Cass Bowers, who is our executive director, and we call her our Queen of Comms. And we also have Ashley Goodman, who's our digital director. So anytime you see All in Wisconsin on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, X, I guess it is now, that's a lot of that is Ashley's design and creation. We can head to the next slide. And so a little bit about us as All in Wisconsin. We are a communications and narrative power building group. We operate on the foundations of the race class narrative, RCN. If you're not familiar with that, look it up. And what we do in community is we work with other organizations, social impact and change organizations, individuals, to really get folks to lean into being great messengers, great storytellers, realizing that organizing doesn't hold too much weight without having narrative power, and vice versa either. So you can be a really good organizer, you can be knocking all the doors, having all the conversations, but if folks aren't leaning into having more conversations with others and knowing what the right framing is and not uplifting opposition's frames, then the organizing is for naught. And if you're a really good communicator and you have that narrative power where you can bring something up in a space and have folks talk about it, but you're not doing the organizing to back it up, well, then we know that doesn't account for much either. So we like to recognize that it's a very critical handshake, and you need both to build that power. We can head to the next slide. And so what we'll do today is we'll highlight a little bit about the history of the media in the United States. We'll talk about the connections between media and democracy and how those can get tenuous or they can really supercharge our democracy and free flow of information. We'll talk about some of the contrasts and distinctions between media is not a monolith. There's different sectors, there's different folks who do different things within media. So we'll talk about those roles and then create somewhat of an understanding around mis, dis, and malinformation. And that can be a whole workshop and presentation on its own. So it'll be very surface level, but hopefully give you guys a 30,000 foot view. We can head to the next slide. Next slide. All right. So who or what is the media? That's a really big question. And in the United States and in other places, traditionally, the media has been known as the fourth estate. So if you think of pillars that hold democracy up, the media is one of those pillars because without folks knowing what's going on, without them being informed, without them knowing the different news or what's happening in Oklahoma or Washington, D.C. or Madison, how are you able to form opinions? How are you able to stay informed and stay abreast of developments, whether that's new laws that are passed or streets that are closed or weather reports? All that stuff is very, very important, right? So we recognize the need in that. And so when we think about media, we like to separate it out. Media and press aren't the same thing. And so when we talk about it, I'm going to read these definitions verbatim so I don't mess them up. So when we talk about the media, it's a power system originally intended to balance the public good against the forces of influence that are controlled by broadcasters and journalists, broadcasters and publishers, excuse me. So traditionally, you have journalists that come in and they want to make sure that whether it's corruption, whether it's folks that are making backroom deals, it gives the common man, one, the know-how that it's happening, but two, it keeps those folks in power honest to say, everything that's done in the dark is going to come to the light because we're going to keep digging, we're going to keep covering it, we're going to break the story, and there's going to be some accountability and consequences if you are found to be in wrongdoing. And we think of the press, that's the individuals. That's the network of journalists, of reporters, the fact checkers, the investigators, the editors, and that their goal is to inform the public. So the press is a part of the media, but they're not always synonymous. So you can have the media without necessarily having everybody in the press, and sometimes the press isn't completely representative of the entirety of the media ecosystem because that's very stratified. The other thing I wanted to focus on is that we know very well that media plays a very, very important role in our democracy. It's informing citizens, it's helping shape public opinion, it's influencing political participation, it's holding leaders accountable, but media can also have the opposite effect. And that can represent misinformation, polarizing people, turning them against each other, and of course, one that we've all been subjected to at different points, manipulation, where they only feed you a certain set of facts, wanting you to come to a certain conclusion or draw a certain opinion, but you don't have the full picture. And we've all been victim of that. And when we get a little bit more into the purposeful shaping of public opinion, that's when we find that the rise of authoritarianism is really empowered. That's when it's easier for folks to come into power and do wrong. Let's hit the next slide, please. And so traditional roles in the media, like I said, is you want to make sure that everyday folks have access to information around policies, laws, access to information about really anything, obituaries, who's passed away in the community, who's getting married in the community, anything. You want folks to be informed. That's the reason why folks started notching things in clay, and then when we had the printer press, Gutenberg started running the presses all day, because it's encouraging people to lean into not having to rely on somebody else. Traditionally, you go back, 300, 400 years, a lot of folks couldn't read. So you had to go to somebody who could take the piece of paper and tell you what it was, what it meant. And you had to rely on that. And so as we've opened up and liberated that access to information, that access to reading, that access to literacy, it's crucial that folks then keep that muscle building. It's not enough just to be able to know how to read as much as it is to be able to form critical thought about what you're reading and about what you're hearing and about what you're seeing. But another traditional role of media is to encourage civic participation and dialogue, to get us to talk to one another and not to have us be stuck in echo chambers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But media also provides information about public policy, government actions, world events, and those are vast and broad. So we'll head to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about where we're at now. And this isn't representative of every sector or every journalist or every press outlet or even the media at large, but we can see that in our country, whether it's with Fox News or even as somebody who watches it myself, MSNBC to a certain extent, we're seeing information being presented without adequate context. It's not balanced. You're getting one side of things. You're getting a lot of opinion news. You're not necessarily getting, here's the facts and you draw your own conclusion. It's folks on TV or on radio or on the op-eds telling you what you should be thinking, how you should be feeling, and they're not giving you the full picture. It's presenting information from a biased perspective, so people want you to join them in their feeling a certain way about a certain issue, and so that's why they're giving you certain facts, or not even facts, just an opinion, hoping that you'll join them in that viewpoint. Contributing to misinformation is huge. If you've watched, was it One America Network? It's all misinformation all the time. And it's very unfortunate because a lot of folks rely on that as their news source primarily. They take what those folks say as they have sincerity behind it. They've done the research, they've gotten the facts, and now they're being presented to me. And so I take that and I run with it. But a lot of us know from watching different outlets, that's not the full picture. It's not the full picture. And of course, advancing disinformation. And that's a little bit different than misinformation because disinformation has a nefarious intent to it. Misinformation is, oh, Kristen told me that, Pizza Hut is selling Big Macs now. And, I don't really check that source. I just go and tell you, yeah, Pizza Hut has Big Macs. That's kind of harmless. Versus Kristen giving me a piece of information and I twist it purposefully to say, oh yeah, Pizza Hut's giving out Big Macs for free and you should go and walk in and if you do a little dance, they'll give you one for free. And now you walk into Pizza Hut and you do the little dance and you're like, where's my Big Mac? And they're like, you look dumb. So that's the misinformation portion of things. And so we know there's some work that we have to do in keeping ourselves in tune with what's going on, but also holding our journalists and our media and our press to account as well. So we'll head to the next slide. And a big piece of this is how do we even get here? How do we get to a point where we're looking around and we're saying, my neighbor is getting a completely different worldview than me? This is not something that necessarily when everybody was listening to Walter Cronkite that you got. Now it's such a different reality, right? And so in school, I remember us, you talk about coups and how authoritarians rise to power in other countries, whether it's Germany, whether that's Afghanistan, whether that's in the Balkans. And you learn that the first thing that folks do is they go and they seize the news station. They send in a paramilitary or the military or just some armed vandals to go and take control of the radio station, to control the newspaper presses, to control the radio station. And so I think a lot of Americans have that in mind when they think of authoritarianism and they think of uh, democracy going the way of the dodo. They say, "Oh, I don't see the military storming NBC and holding folks at gunpoint, so that's not a coup, right?" It's happened differently here in America. I don't know all the reasons why, but one of the reasons why is because corporate and moneyed interests assess that we don't have to do it by gunpoint. We can slowly just buy up independent outlets. We can slowly buy up all these different radio stations. And we'll get to a point where now in America we have 6 companies that control, I believe it's about 95% of what you're receiving on the airwaves. And that's troubling, right? No, we have antitrust and anti-monopoly laws for a reason. And that should also apply to our press. So when we're thinking of how do we reverse it, it's not as simply put as we kick out the military or we go to NBC and we reassert control of the news stations. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's making sure that folks know how to critically think and to how to process and how to question sources and how to do some secondary and tertiary research. And so I'll pause there and we'll talk a little bit about different types of media. And David's going to come up and slot that in.
Now you'll all get to see the difference between an organizer and a messenger. I don't wax as poetic as Kyle, but we're going to get through this together. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So Kyle alluded that we're going to talk about different kinds of media, and today I thought we would show you how we break it down at All In, not only when we work with the media, but when we consume media ourselves and when we help our people across Wisconsin do the same. So the first 3 colorful boxes are the way that we break down the actual kind of media or press we're working with. When we say broadcast media, we're talking about your news and your radio. I'll let you decide what news is, but when we talk about it, we mean everything from the evening news right up to the 24/7 news networks that don't stop. Then we have digital media, and we're talking about social media platforms, blogs, podcasts, streaming services, anything that you can get on your handy little pocket computer, that's our digital media. And then print media, newspapers, magazines, and the like. Now, all of those categories exist in one or more of the things in the black box: legacy, independent, and new media. And that's where things start to get a little bit tricky, where we start to see some of those behaviors that Kyle talked about and the challenges that we went through in the last couple slides. So when we say the legacy media, we're talking about corporately controlled sources that have become consolidated and often compromised. They exhibit centralized production. They use something called the one-to-many model, which is where there is a single source, often hidden from the public, that controls multiple outlets, and they are delivering the exact same message in unison, often to passive audiences. They act as gatekeepers for the news. The legacy media has decided that they're the ones who determine what is and is not news. And they operate under some formal standards, some imposed by the government, others imposed by their corporate overlords. When I talk about the independent media, that's sources that operate free from that direct corporate or government control. They don't have corporate ownership. They often have diverse funding streams, so they're not as accountable to one or just a couple of pots of money to do their business, and they often work in niche or underrepresented focuses so that they can actually get to know and communicate with their audiences on a deeper level. Then new media, digital native platforms that allow two-way interaction between users and content. So we're talking Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, all the stuff that my kids walk around with on their phone. I'm guilty of it too sometimes. And those come with some really great advantages, but also some serious challenges, right? They're interactive, allowing that two-way communication of consuming some news or media, but also immediately being able to respond and broadcast your response. It's filter free, so oftentimes footage is raw, stories are unedited, there is not that layered approach of filtering before the audience receives it. It's immediate. Something is happening, you can watch it live as it goes down. You can watch users comment. You can watch your own comments go out. Flexible delivery, like I said, not just Kristen.
You can finish your thought.
No, go ahead.
My question is, where would you now put NPR on this and PBS now that it's no longer publicly funded? And somebody like Don Lemon, who was at CNN, but now can do whatever he wants, but is a seasoned journalist. So I wouldn't lump him in the same place as just some guy with a Twitter account, right?
Right.
So what do you think about the changes that it's?
Thank you. Okay, so the question was, as we start to categorize our media sources, where would we put things like, you said, WPR, NPR, and PBS, or journalists like Don Lemon, who, those first categories were previously publicly funded and are no longer. Don Lemon has a serious journalistic background, working with some legacy media, but now does not. So I would put them both in the independent media category, largely because no corporate ownership, still diverse funding. And I would put the dude with the Twitter account, read me, in new media. I actually don't have a Twitter account, but if I did, that's where I would be. Okay, so that was a lot of information. So before we go on, I want to pause to see if anyone else has any other questions. Yes, sir.
I don't know if it's appropriate time to do that, but legacy media, that seems to be the emerging media outlet these days. Everything from unemployed journalists who are doing blogs, reporting the best they can, limited funding, but also people like Steve Colbert, Charlie Behrens, the local comedian who went after the power plants, data centers. He was front and center with that, and he's also an unemployed journalist. So we turn it down. I'm not going there, but I think legacy is sort of emerging. My wife listens to somebody on legacy media all the time who does the hard reporting that networks no longer touch.
I'm not familiar.
So the question I have is, I was just trying to set this up. Let's say you headed up the news desk in an organization. You had 4 reporters. What would you assign them to do if they had beats?
Ooh, role playing. So the question is, if I was running a newsroom and I had 4 reporters, what would I assign them to do? As permanent beats. Okay, so I think that if I were making that decision, knowing that my end goal is to deliver information to an audience that they can consume, comprehend, and make informed decisions with, I would really try to assign the beats for those reporters probably congruent with their lived experiences or educational backgrounds, because I feel like that automatically makes their reporting relatable. And I think that that's something that is really missing in a lot of ways. Apparently, not with your magic guy who is ahead of the game, and I'm going to have to look him up.
Yeah, it's JS just did. They've launched a project in which they're trying to reestablish connections with central city Milwaukee. So they actually have reporters go out and do neighborhood projects.
That's wonderful.
So they can connect with neighborhoods that haven't been reported on for a long time, and they develop sourcing that you trust. And it's becoming quite successful.
That's excellent.
I think just like one last question here. Well, actually, as you're probably aware,
media outlets, especially the print media, don't have the money to hire reporters in. So they've turned to private funding sources, nonprofits, to pay for the reporters. Of course, there's a strict code of you can't influence the reporters, even though you're paying yourself. Do you think that presents any kind of threat to journalism or?
Okay, so the question is, correct me if I paraphrase it incorrectly, is that as funding sources narrow, especially for print media, to pay for reporting services, does that pose a threat to journalistic standards? My personal opinion, yes. And I think that's backed up by the fact that particularly broadcast and print media have been suffering an incredible decline in public trust over the last 10 years. Where an organization's funding comes from is not only going to influence the standards by which that organization has to operate, but whether or not they're transparent about what and where that funding is coming from affects how the public will interact with them. And you're right that it is there is a shrinking number of reporters, especially for print media. We're seeing more and more large publications go to AI to write lifestyle articles and whatever have you, but many will tell you that could be a slippery slope.
The last thing I want to point out is it seems that all the TV outlets now are drifting towards good news. Even national, they end their nightly report with some guy who went out and picked up 30 tires. Something that's really inconsequential, but I don't quite know what the lure is. Do we need good news?
I'll get to you, I promise. So the question was, we're noticing a pattern of more and more news being focused on good news, often seemingly inconsequential good news. And what is the reason for that? Distraction and deflection. If we don't talk about the inconsequential good feel-good stories, we have to talk about what's going on in the world around us. And that's a really hard pill for a lot of people to swallow right now. And oftentimes, going back to your question, it could be possible that funders and pressure from outside sources have put in standards for what we can and cannot talk about, or what we do and do not perceive to be news.
Imagine that you're like a Lou Grant kind of director of a newsroom, and corporate comes down and says, "We want you to do this, this, and this." I mean, is that going on, or is the conflict with veteran news people? Well, I guess 60 Minutes is a good example, right?
Sure. I mean, I would put forward, the question is, do we see conflicts between sort of like corporate coming in and issuing mandates about what can and cannot be reported? We went through a slew of journalists and meteorologists and other news professionals in Wisconsin losing their jobs because they defied those corporate orders. So I think while I don't have firsthand experience, and I want to make sure I don't claim to in front of a lawyer, we have seen and heard from the people it happened to that does occur. Next question.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, like, I know one of the things you're talking about is responsibility of the media, right? Is that the responsibility of the media to us, the public? Because then I would think all 9 of these subcomponents have the same responsibility. Like, even if I'm new media broadcasting, I would have the same responsibility to the public, because you're allowed to use the airwaves. Is that the responsibility you're talking about, or are you talking about responsibility like whoever signs the checks, the media is responsible to that, you know, who's calling the shots?
We're kind of talking about a little bit of both. When we went through sort of like the media's responsibility to us and really what their roles ought to be in a healthy democracy, I think that anyone could make the argument that it would apply to any of these categories. I think there are a good number of people who will exempt new media, largely because a good portion of new media aren't actually journalists. There could be anyone who goes live on Facebook and goes viral counts as new media, and I'm not sure if they're not claiming to be a journalist that we can really put that many ethical standards on what they're broadcasting. Correct. But we will talk a little bit later in the presentation about media literacy and how we ask ourselves questions when we're consuming media to know what we should expect from our news sources. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, this is where we're gonna get a little down and dirty, and this is where I have fun in my day job. These are oftentimes things that I cover when Kristen gets those code orange, code blue, code yellow emails from me because something wild has happened in the world. So what is the shift that Kyle talked to you about in our media? What does it look like to us when we're consuming the news? The media uses a multitude of techniques to deliver their news. And the ones that we're going to talk today are the ones that contribute to that biased perspective, misinformation, and disinformation. To repeat Kyle's disclaimer, not blanketing the press, saying that they all do this, but saying this is what we need to watch out for. So that first one, what does the shift look like? Scripting. I mentioned earlier a one-to-many model. I'm not sure if I know that we had some tech problems. So when we get to a slide in the future, there's going to be a video. And if the audio works, you're going to get a really clear picture of what I'm talking about when I talk to scripting and the one-to-many model. But that is when that story comes down from corporate and it is verbatim spelled out and they read it. And it happens all across the country every night on the nightly news. Okay. Then framing. Okay, so framing is a concept in communications where pertaining to information deployment, and it is a tool used by some for good and some for bad to either clarify or deceive. Again, we're going to talk about the ones that affect how we consume news negatively. So the first one I want to talk about is labeling. And I chose that one first because you have all experienced it in this primary that we're in right now. Labeling involves assigning a word that has a very specific connotation to an issue, a piece of news, or a person. Examples include, are you ready? Radical, extreme, socialist, communist, un-American, dangerous, establishment. We've heard all of those. All of those words evoke a very serious connotation right away for people. And by repeatedly labeling as an issue or a person, the media can influence how everyone in this room perceives them. Another tool of framing is called emotional loading. And so this is where the way a story is presented uses things like fear appeals or outrage framing, catastrophizing, where they'll deliver a piece of news and tell you it's the worst thing that could possibly happen to you this calendar year. And it often isn't. Moral panic or us versus them narratives, right? All of that emotional loading as you're receiving that information creates a response from you and oftentimes completely influences how we react to it. Another one is cherry picking. And so that's when we're using isolated examples or incomplete information, presenting it out of context to prove a point. False dichotomies. You either support this or you hate freedom. We've heard that one for several years, right? But that's a really good example. I think a lot of us are growing immune to that, but it's still being used. The last one I'll talk about today is loaded language. And that's when you hear people using buzzwords or slogans, pejorative descriptions, and euphemisms to really sort of like evoke a meaning without actually saying what they're saying, but you know what they're saying. You hear this a lot in doc whistles, and it's happening a lot right now with the news that's going on in Madison, actually. So all of those tools of framing and information delivery can be used to paint you the way you take news in, like I've been saying. The same event can be described using two very different languages. And so headline A could read, tax relief plan helps working families. Same news, different outlet, government spending package expands budget deficit. They're reporting the exact same thing, but they've used two very different framing principles to deliver that news. So you want to focus on, when you're looking for things like that, when you get a bad feeling about a piece of media that you've consumed or you feel like something's not quite right, or you realize that you're giving a strong emotional response to a piece of news, look at your word choice, look at the images they're delivering with that piece of news, look for emotional language. If they use experts in their news story, consider maybe how they selected them, and evaluate whether or not context was there. All of that will help you as you answer those questions to know, is this being framed? Kristen.
One of the things that drives me nuts is when a law firm files a suit, wins a suit, whatever, it's a story about a law firm, the outlets will label that firm. Liberal law firm, Law Forward, has filed this case for voting rights. Or conservative law firm, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, has done da-da-da-da. That just, no, it's not a question, I'm just telling you it drives me crazy. Like, the liberal organization, the League of Women Voters, blah, 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 blah. It's like, how dare you? Label, why have we decided that if you're pro-democracy, you're liberal?
Oh, I mean, that was a question, and I don't think you want me to answer it.
See what the lawsuit was about and make up, and just that's it. Why do you have to label the firm?
Kristen, we're live. We gotta
I don't care.
I love it. But just so that everyone out there knows,
Media outlets get back to me on that.
Kristen brought up a good point about how news media often labels organizations or lawsuits with the words liberal or conservative to sort of already conjure an acceptance or rejection from the audience. And that's absolutely true. And that is a really great example of framing. And so all of these pieces are used in something that's called agenda setting. It's a communications concept that's actually been studied over and over, and the media is, I'm going to use the legal term, often guilty of it. What they do is they intentionally, they being some, influence what people think about, even when they don't always determine what people think, right? So an example that I will give you, if a news outlet devotes weeks and weeks and weeks to immigration coverage, it becomes a priority issue for voters. If economic issues dominate those headlines, voters will prioritize inflation and employment every single time. That media attention and spin, excuse me, can influence political conversations, candidate priorities, and legislative focus. And that really is how we're talking about the media's role reaching into democracy and having effects for good and bad. So if we can go to the next slide. You'll want to have
Hi,
the
I'm
audio,
Fox
but even
San
without the audio,
Antonio's
it's
Jessica
fine.
Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities.
The El Paso, Las Cruces communities.
Eastern Iowa communities.
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
We are concerned about
troubling and irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
Plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
False news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these things simply aren't true without checking facts first. Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 No.
This is extremely
Right.
dangerous to our democracy.
Syndicated news
This is extremely dangerous to our
Right.
democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our
Thank you so
democracy.
much for finding that.
dangerous to our democracy.
I apologize, it's been negative. Everybody's in the nation's getting the same thing at the same time. Is that one issue? Or the message is the same at the same time? Or, there's other symbols that we're missing. What is the impact of everybody in the nation getting bad information or good information at the same time? Give me the dynamics.
So the question is, to paraphrase, what's the downside of the entire nation getting the same message at the same time? And so you have to consider the quality of the message, the framing of the message, motive, and then audience. Largely, the consumers of the nightly news, which is what we just saw, are considered a passive audience, right? We choose to focus, and watch the news. Similar with when I mentioned the 24/7 news networks that just, we can't get away from them. You go to the doctor, there's Fox News. You go to the orthodontist, there's Fox News. I take my kids to the mall, there's Fox News. Like, they're everywhere. And so when, again, going back to not all, but some media, for instance, that particular message, we care about our community. We know you. We're here for you. We only deliver the news you can trust, except they're delivering that message in 50 states verbatim. And so you question the authenticity of it. So when
Gaslighting the whole country.
that is what can happen. That's exactly where I was going, and that is the word I was going to use. When compromised messages are delivered in the one-to-many model, you can have the effect of gaslighting the public. Yes.
And the problem with that situation was, if I remember correctly, there was like a half dozen of the stations that refused, they were not gonna broadcast that. And so they got kicked out of the broadcast company, Sinclair, I think it was, they were no longer Sinclair stations, they were sold off right away after they fired the reporter and stuff, 'cause they wouldn't read it.
Correct.
Which then goes against your entire message about how you're about freedom and broadcasting.
Yes. Absolutely. Can we go one more, please? Maybe. Okay, so this is a framing example, and this is fresh and new. This is coverage from Madison. The last big code email that Kristen received from me was the morning that the police moved on the memorial site in Madison this week. And one of the things that I do before I send those big code emails to the entire state is I take a look at the difference between how legacy media and how new media are reporting on a situation, and I search for discrepancies. And those discrepancies tell me where I need to message to organizations and people across the state. And this is an example of that morning, a discrepancy in framing. On the left is a legacy media post from CBS 58 with a picture of the memorial site on a sunny day. And the caption says, just in this morning, officials entered the site early in the morning, asking individuals to gather their belongings. The next post was a live feed from someone I actually know standing in Madison, showing a row of officers in riot gear with a row of bulldozers behind them. And I don't know about you, and I'm not going to tell you how to interpret this, but that's a weird way to ask nicely for something. And so this is an example when I talk about framing. And my first clue, that's being generous. A clue, a very big clue when CBS hit with this post, as I knew it was happening in Madison, I knew it was a cloudy, dreary day and it had just stopped raining. And that picture was very clearly taken the day before. And so that was my instinct of immediately I have to go look. Good. Okay, next slide, please. I'm off the hook. You've had enough of me, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kyle to close us out on some media literacy tips.
Thank you, David. So, yeah, media literacy is one of the most important skills we can have today to serve our democracy. And it's not even really a new need. It's something that we've had a need for quite a while. Who's familiar with yellow journalism at all? So back in the late 1800s, right, you had Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst who were saying, well, if we just embellish a little here and make this a little bit more salacious, then we'll sell more newspapers. And folks eventually were like, well, the Spanish-American War has romance involved and it has this thing involved. That doesn't seem quite right. We want some balance here. That ended up transitioning into the muckrackers who were, you had Ida Tarbell, you had Upton Sinclair, you had, who else? Jacob Riis, I believe, who, despite the president at the time, Theodore Roosevelt, excoriating them a little bit and saying, all they want to do is focus with what's wrong with the country. They were pointing out the fact that folks were being poisoned. Folks were dying because of labor abuses. Folks were being stolen from, whether that was their land or their wages. And they said, it's not okay that just because you have more money or you have more access to political power, that you can just gloss over quite frankly, atrocities to folks. You can treat the common man any which way. And so they went hard. And they went hard. And they went hard. Upton Sinclair sat in jail as he ran for president. No, it was Eugene Debs. I'm sorry, I'm mixing up my folks. But either way, folks were prosecuted and at much cost to their careers, their personal lives, because they decided to keep digging deeper. And it also encouraged the common person to say, well, I can't just trust whatever I'm hearing or whatever I'm seeing. And that's why when David says, if you're getting a funny feeling in your stomach, trust it a little bit. Now, don't trust it completely and say, well, I have a funny feeling in my stomach, so that must be fake news. Dig. Find out. Ask questions. Ask your friends. Ask your family. Hey, did you read the same thing? Or what did you read this morning in the news? So pointing out some things that we can absolutely do, you want to think critically. So asking questions like, who created this information? Could any context or details be missing? Either because it's purposeful and malicious, or because this is one journalist who got the beat and was trying to break the story, so they left out a couple details. But maybe another journalist got some of those details included. Is the headline designed to invoke a certain reaction? If you're reading a headline, like David said, you're immediately feeling anger or you're immediately feeling sadness, that's not a bad thing, but it's something you want to interrogate and dive a little bit deeper into. You want to look for evidence. So what evidence supports the information that you just read? Are there multiple sources that are credible that are reporting it? Or is it just this one that has these details in it? And you can't find anywhere else that has these details. Maybe it's a really, really good journalist. Maybe it's a really, really good publication. Or maybe it's not everything's smelling quite good. You want to avoid echo chambers. And this is a huge one, especially in today's day and age where we're all on our phones, we're swiping through the reels, the algorithms got a hold of us. These social media companies are incentivized to keep our attention. And they're not going to necessarily keep our attention if they're showing us things that we don't like, or that we don't agree with, or that don't necessarily align with our worldview. So it'll feed you whatever you want to hear. Right, wrong, indifferent, or otherwise. So be cognizant of getting caught in echo chambers. That's on X, that's on Blue Sky, that's on Facebook, and that's in your own personal life too, and actually interacting with people. You should have people who you disagree with, maybe it's based on policy or different religions. I'm not saying your best friend should be a Nazi. That's not what I'm advocating for. But people who say, hey, listen, Frank, I hear what you're saying, but what about this perspective? That's something that you always want to have. You want to evaluate discrepancies between legacy, independent, and other media. Ask yourself when you read something, what categories does this fall under? CNN? Oh, that's legacy media. Okay. This podcaster? That's new media. What is this podcaster's qualifications? To David's point, I can buy a microphone tomorrow. I can set up my little podcast show, and I could have 500,000 listeners in 2 months if I have all the right ads and do all the right things, but that doesn't make me qualified. I'm not held to journalistic ethics. I never went to journalism school, but people say, oh, that's a guy who has a lot of people listening to him, so maybe I should listen to him as well. So be cognizant of that. Funding. Who is paying these people? Who is paying for these materials? The Washington Post, back in 2000, probably a really good publication. Now, even the folks who work there that now no longer work there say, well, Jeff Bezos bought us out, and he took all the power away from the editors, and now it's really just a rag for whatever he wants to be spoken about. And, if you probably look in the Washington Post, you probably won't see a lot of articles about Amazon abusing their workers and price gouging and things of that nature. Why is that? You want to think about regulatory pressures, what controls from the government sources affect this reporting. That's a big thing that we saw lately with Jimmy Kimmel, that we saw with 60 Minutes, that we saw with CBS, where the government now feels comfortable exerting pressure on different outlets to speak a certain way or not to speak a certain way. And then lastly, the point is, it's not to mistrust the press, but to develop that critical thought of not being skeptic or paranoid, but not being too gullible and believing the first thing that you see or read. So keep digging, keep in tune with folks who are trying to get you a certain way or trying to sway your opinion. But media literacy helps us become the people who are informed consumers rather than those passive audiences that David were talking about. And that's what they want. A lot of these corporations, to your point about your question of what's their end goal, it's so we don't have that critical thought. So we don't question the CEOs. So we don't question the different elected officials. We just say, okay, well, if you say it's blue, the sky is green, my eyes may tell me it's blue, but I've learned not to question it. So I'm just going to go right along with you. And so lastly, the media should play an informative role in a healthy democracy, but it's always up to us to ensure that information that we consume fits that description, now more than ever. So I'll pause there. Thank you all so much for the time, and if anybody has any other questions.
And what I see you guys saying, and it kind of rings true in everything that happens today, is there's this sort of formula to get people all upset and excited and do something without it.
Yep.
Feel good example of that. In fact, today, I got a notice from somebody that was important, a financial thing, that my information has made it to the dark web. And so my first reaction was, oh shit.
I'm in trouble. Yeah.
And my second reaction is too, was, wait a minute. If you open this up and then it says, fill out a form and give us your social security number and your account number, is it real? And so we did. We called the right people to say, is this real?
Check some sources.
But check your sources. But I find the news is doing the same thing these days. Certain news I will see, I don't really see Facebook as a news source for me.
Sure.
But if I see something on Facebook and it says, Iran is sending airplanes to Bamako or something, I will look on the news. I will check CBS, CNN, I will check another news before I go say, oh my God. But a lot of people won't stop and say, wait a minute, this has all the signs and warnings of a scam. And I'm afraid because journalists, I've been pretty proud of the news for a long time and trust it. But even now, I think both of us feel like you gotta check it out before you go get all excited and upset.
Definite parallels to what you guys skillfully talked about to what's happening on the internet.
Yeah.
And I know that's off target,
but it's the same procedure.
Yeah. I mean, it's on target because more and more folks are relying on the internet, even Facebook, for their news.
Yeah.
So
I should have brought this as a graphic when it went around all the news stations when they showed where and what channels the recent Democratic primary debate would be aired on.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody noticed, but if you live north of Wausau, you didn't get it.
Really?
I used to live in Ashland. I lived in Ashland, Wisconsin on the south shore of Lake Superior for about 12 years. All of our news, if you're lucky enough to pull it in on Signal, comes from Minnesota.
Oh, that's fine.
There is
That's why
no...
you even got the Vikings game.
Yes, there's no Wisconsin broadcast that's reliable above Highway 8.
Yeah, that is.
And so when we worked and did organizing there, overwhelmingly, something like 95% of our base reported that their primary source of news was social media.
Which is not good.
No, it's
at all.
not.
One of the guardrails, like you were talking about.
Yeah.
But when you were talking, I just noticed that it invokes the same reaction, like, oh God, I gotta do something because I'm in the dark web, and that could be really dangerous.
Absolutely.
But it wasn't. I mean, we handled it.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, but I find the news using the same techniques, not necessarily the newspapers, but the evening news.
Yep.
Or the TV news.
If it bleeds, it leads, right?
Yeah.
Or it's some puff piece about somebody saved the ducklings.
The international hula contest.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they ended with the hula hoop contest, and they started with "We're all gonna die." Yeah, all within a half an hour.
They get your heart pumping and end it off, and you're like, oh, I can go to bed happy, just to repeat the cycle tomorrow, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Why your toaster's going to kill you?
So
Piggybacking on what she was talking about,
knowing what we now know about what we would call the legacy media, ABC, CBS, NBC, and their willingness to go along with the pressure being applied to them, should we still consider them a reliable source if we're going to fact check something? Oh, CBS said so about this article, but should we trust them more than, because nobody seems to say who the reporters are, the investigative reporters or anything anymore. It's just a story, it's all told by the same guy sitting at the desk. So you don't know, because it used to be you could follow, well, I trust that reporter.
Right.
And you could follow them, and their stories, you know, they did a good job.
Absolutely.
We don't have any of that anymore now, so do you still consider like what would be our traditional media as reliable sources when we're fact checking stuff we hear about?
I would say yes, I do, at least to a certain extent, and it's more of a kaleidoscope for me. So that's just one hexagon, and I check that against some of the independent and the new media folks, and then I check that against some of the Substack and the Medium. Maybe I'll listen to a podcast if they have an expert on, and through that combination, all right, now I get most of where the facts are, or I can say, okay, well, this guy was saying something completely different that I didn't hear from these three other sources. I got to cut that one out. It's unreliable. They're not reliable narrators. I think they are to a certain extent. You still have to be on your P's and Q's. You have to be on guard. But I would say they are reliable to a certain extent. You just don't take it at face value and have that curiosity to dig deeper or to question every little aspect of the story. It's, the days of Tom Brokaw and Barbara Walters being around are over. And I think a lot of folks are still used to that. I don't question authority, and I view news as authority. And there's people that historically, I could trust. Now it's not that way anymore. So you kind of need, I don't know how many folks watch baseball, but you need that bullpen. You need a strong bullpen. You can't just rely on one ace pitcher anymore. You got to have a strong rotation of folks.
Imagine Sam Donaldson.
It would be a sight to behold. Yes, ma'am.
I was just gonna say that it's hard with the new media, because how do you trust, how do you decide whether you can trust those folks as well? So I think, you need to go after all of that, but to me, at least in some of the legacy, you have some of that legacy.
Sure.
But it's, how do you decide whether it's some of the new media, this podcaster that has a million followers?
Right.
How do you know?
You look at their bona fides. Are they a Joe Rogan who purports himself to be master of all knowledge? Or are they somebody who facilitates conversation and discussion and say, oh, I know a lot, but I don't know what I don't know. So I have Dr. So-and-so here who attended Penn State or UPenn or Harvard or whatever wonderful institution to come talk about it. And then you look into that person too. Say, well, how legitimate is this person? It requires work. It's not so easy as being able to just crank on AM or FM anymore and just take it all in. But was it ever? Or, did a lot of us get into a habit of, everything's pretty true. And now we're like, I don't know. Going back to 1890s, even those folks had to dig into the sources a little bit too, right? So you just gotta do a little research and dig in. And it's hard because we have lives to balance and kids to watch and school and job to go to, but it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile.
Let's do one more question.
Yes.
I was going to say something I've noticed the last day or so that made me feel good about the media I'm consuming is if I'm talking to a person, I know I can trust them, even if they're wrong. And a lot of people are doing retractions and corrections in the last day or so about, listen to politics. The Michigan Senate race.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be 15 points. It was almost not even 1 point difference between the two Democratic candidates.
Sure.
But they're going back and talking about that and saying, why were we wrong? Now that's someone I can trust.
Absolutely.
Whereas if they just skip on to the next story, that's someone you don't trust.
That's a great
So
point.
Retractions and corrections are something you can always go look for.
That's a really great point. Well, thank y'all so much.
Thank you so much.
Hope not to be strangers. Hope to see y'all again in the future.
Jim, can you do a condensed version and splash minutes?
We can do some content here in the next 12 or 14 minutes or so. Let's do a little bit, entirely different focus to all this. We'll do some history, a little bit of constitutional law, and then some civics challenges of recent times. Frederick Douglass, to suppress free speech is a double wrong. And the reason why that's up there, it animates much of what we think about in the Constitution. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. And that notion of a bifurcated First Amendment is where that comes from. Take a look at some of that history up there right now. Colonial times, during the times of our Revolutionary War, that notion of both the speaker and the one who's spoken to, that's what animated the First Amendment. Mid to late 18th century newspapers were the key ways of communicating. And so a lot of the litigation, a lot of the cases we're going to talk about are premised upon print media as opposed to the things we just talked about. And again, the passage of the Bill of Rights combines this notion of the marketplace of ideas and the role of journalists in holding the newly formed government accountable, which we also just heard about. Next slide, Jacob. So let's do a very, very brief law school review here of some of the things that are out there. This is not in chronological order. This is my attempt to sort of codify what I view as the top 10 cases when it comes to Supreme Court decisions that they have rendered about freedom of the press, the First Amendment, those kinds of things. And you'll see about 2 or 3 major themes that come out of here. The first one is the concept of prior restraint way back in 1931, the notion that courts, government should not restrain the exercise of free speech. It doesn't mean you can't be held liable for things that you say down the road after it's issued, but the notion of censorship or prohibition, that's the concept of prior restraint out there a lot. The Chief Justice Warren Burger used that in the following case. That's the Stewart case. Another case that's significant even today, Kuhlmeyer. It's a situation where you have a school newspaper, and the question is whether or not government, and in particular a school district, can censor prior restraint, but also going forward, can censor a student newspaper. And the answer is yes. The Supreme Court said that if, in fact, there is something that's inconsistent with some shared values, packed full of meaning there, not an uncontroversial decision there, but Kuhlmeyer says that indeed schools can limit the capacity of students to speak out. Brandsburg versus Hayes, issues about reporters, and that's what we're going to get to in just a moment or so at the end of our time here tonight. Can you compel a reporter to come in and testify before a grand jury about his or her sources? And the answer, once again, back in 1971 is yes, you can if there's a compelling or paramount state interest. See there, this emergence of kind of a balancing test that goes on here. The Cowles Media Company, again, does not prevent a lawsuit for money damages against one of those legacy institutions that breaks its promise of confidentiality about sources. Again, a number of different concepts there, but coming out again in the mid to late 20th century. Next slide, Jacob. Yes.
I was going to ask, so the case you highlighted with the school,
yes.
Was it because they were minors? Like just in general, when do we get our rights?
Right.
5 years old, do I have rights?
All right. The answer is the Supreme Court in many, many ways says because you are a minor, and because you are not yet an adult, we're not going to vest in you all these rights. You become 18, and then we do. At the same time, there's another case that's not up here. It's the case involving advocacy about the Vietnam War, and that comes out of Iowa. And the Supreme Court said you do not check your rights to freedom of speech at the schoolhouse gate. And that applies to students and teachers alike. So there's a little bit of a dichotomy there, yeah.
That's the black armband.
It is.
I think they were 18 years old. That was the issue.
Actually, they weren't. No, they were in high school. But again, the notion that that there are limits on what minors can and cannot do, and authority figures can come in, and that's why Kuhlmeyer is so very significant. It came as a surprise to many people that you can censor school newspapers. It has to be done based upon balancing. It's not to say you can't file lawsuits, but the Supreme Court giving an awful lot of authority to school districts to do those kinds of things. Yeah, not without its controversy. Yeah.
I can also ask just on the issue of who has the rights. In the recent discussions about immigration, it has seemed like the government has been arguing that if I'm a non-American, on American soil, I don't have rights. Is that correct, or do all humans on this land?
It is not right. So one of the things we've talked about a lot, and it goes to the applicability of this thing called the Constitution. Doesn't matter if you're a citizen or a resident, if you're here illegally, you get the benefits of this. And that includes free speech, right? That includes all those other things, the First Amendment, Third Amendment, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, right to counsel, all that sort of thing, freedom from inappropriate searches by the government. The fact that you are here physically means you get the protections. And you know who said that most recently? Antonin Scalia did. So again, important to remember that. Get that question a lot today. Again, plainly, what we're going to be doing in less than a week now, voting, you have to be a citizen. And that's, again, an aspect not only of the Constitution, but of state law. But any other rights out there, constitutional rights, those apply to everybody who happens to be here, including, that's why in the immigration area, that's why I often say it may well be that this particular person should not be here. They may be deportable, but the reason why this administration has gotten into so much trouble in that area is they have not afforded them what? Due process. You place people on planes, send them to El Salvador without giving them what they're entitled to under the Constitution. So once again, the notion is if you are here, you get the protections of our Constitution. True in the state of Wisconsin, too, the same kind of thing. And important to note. But again, in all these areas, you've got this balancing going on, and it's not quite as clear. The point of this actually is it's not quite as clear as you might think. Let's take a look at a few more of these. Cameras in a courtroom. The court has said that a trial judge that permits cameras in the courtroom is not violating a Sixth Amendment right, a right to counsel, a right to representation. So you can, in fact, constitutionally have reporters who want to see what's going on inside courtrooms. Interestingly, in the federal courts, we do not have that. Challenges out there to the Chief Justice who said, nope, no recording in courtrooms. New York Times versus Sullivan, we talked about that in one of our very first cases. That probably should be higher up on my list. This is the case that basically comes out of the civil rights movement. Some allegations made against law enforcement, public officials, for the way in which they're responding to Martin Luther King. There's an ad placed in the New York Times. It turns out it's inaccurate about what the particular official had done, and sues for defamation. Basically, you lied about what I did. And the Supreme Court comes back and says, if you are a public official out there, the only way that you can be held, the only way that you can hold media responsible is if you establish that the media acted with actual malice in doing what they printed. Intentional, willful, proven intent to defame. A few other cases here. Actual malice then applies not just to public officials, but also other people who we think about in the public domain, politicians, business people, entertainment celebrities, also the same kind of actual malice standard. Gertz versus Welch goes in the opposite direction, says that if you are truly a private person, then the regular defamation standards apply to you. You don't have to show actual malice. It may well be that you can simply show that you have been defamed, that things said about you are done properly, willfully, but are simply wrong. And then this is, I think, one of the most important ones. That's the reason why it's actually at the top, even though it's the bottom of the list here. New York Times versus Sullivan. This is Pentagon Papers. And this is where government comes right up against the capacity of media to publish things. This was Daniel Ellsberg, obviously. And the question is whether or not a court, a federal court in this case, can stop the publication of the Pentagon Papers, all about, obviously, the Vietnam War. And there, again, the Supreme Court says, like all these other things, you balance things. There are some basic standards for balancing the interests. And here, the interests in protecting the national security, about the war, other things going on, are less than the interest of the public in knowing what's happening. So there's your very, very quick review of what's going on generally in the area of Supreme Court cases. And that's Earl Warren. The previous picture was Warren Burger. Again, you see a lot of these happening again, 1960s, 1970s, a bit of 1980s. We've got them going on today, of course, as well. But a lot of this constitutional stuff comes out of that time in the 20th century. Jacob, next slide. Let's do a little bit of current events in our last few moments here and talk about things, 4 of them in particular, that you have all witnessed. And this is, again, a different area. What you have here are what I will call attacks on the media by the government, right? And so if you think about the First Amendment, once again, government and the Congress, but government generally, should not do anything to infringe the right of the free press. Ask yourself if the First Amendment is being upheld, frankly, by the present administration when it does things like this. 4 of them. You can choose many of them that are out there. Let's do the next slide, Jacob. This happened just a couple of days ago. This is the president. You all know about the plane coming from Qatar, right? And the gift from the Qatari government to the president. Lots and lots of controversy about that as he's going overseas, as you know. The authorities and the people who are responsible for the president's safety say, no, we're not going back on that plane. We've got some real security issues. And along the way, you've got a New York Times reporter was already onto this story, but reports on the fact that this plane has lots and lots of problems with it when it comes to security issues. And the president, who sees this in the New York Times, responds badly. Sometimes he does that. And what we have is then an attempt by the president to find out who leaked the information to the media about this plane. And what he does, what the Department of Justice does, what the FBI does, is they issue subpoenas to the New York Times, the reporters, asking them, who told you this, okay? Just as an aside, and it's important for this and the other cases, when it comes to the process inside the Department of Justice, where I worked for 30 years, there are 2 groups of people for whom you've got to get supreme authority to go after them on subpoenas and other applications. One of them are lawyers. And the reason is not because we love lawyers across the board, but because attorney-client relationship, you don't want to affect that. It is very difficult to get a subpoena to go into the office of a defense counsel. Why? You don't want to affect that capacity of the attorney. The other one are journalists. And it's this notion, once again, that the Department of Justice should be enforcing the First Amendment. We stay away from journalists until it's the very last thing that you can possibly do. You explore all other avenues. And only then, once again, if you really have a need to know. If it's simply a vindictive interest in knowing about it, cannot get it. I don't recall any time in the 30 years that I was with the Department of Justice, at least our local office, applied for a subpoena or any sort of grand jury appearance for a reporter. And that's why this reaction by New York Times, other places, other entities, is so extreme. What happens is the New York Times moves to quash the subpoenas. That's Arun Subramanian, and he is a district judge in the District of Columbia. Just a day or so ago, he looks at the government and says, what are you doing? You're not following your own internal requirements for getting approval. And by that, once again, this is the last thing you do, not the first thing you do. You explore every other avenue before you undermine the capacity of reporters under the First Amendment. And then I won't go into it because of time. There's an amazing exchange between him and the lawyers, once again, which we see a lot in federal courts today, and going back and forth and chastising them for not following, again, the internal processes and for violating the Constitution. In the end, what happens during the course of the hearing, when this is going so badly, the Department of Justice attorneys ask the judge for a brief hiatus, a brief time away. They go and they talk to the attorneys from the New York Times, and your Justice Department attorneys come back, and they say, Judge, we're going to withdraw the subpoenas entirely. And the judge says, good, thank you very much, case is over. And you get the New York Times saying this is what a free press is all about. That just happened a couple of days or so ago. Here's the next one. Again, same kind of thing. This is a while back. This is the Washington Post. You may recall there's a reporter, and she is reporting upon the criminal charges against someone who has allegedly been stealing information, national defense information from the Pentagon. That focus of the case is not what this is about, but during the course of her reporting on all this, she may or may not have actually disclosed some things that are about national defense. And once again, what you get is an attempt to try to go after her. They go into her home, which again is extraordinary to get a search warrant for their home of a reporter. What do? They seize all of her electronic devices. You can see what they are all up there. And the question is that legal? The magistrate judge here, and it was in Eastern Virginia, again, a troubled district historically, as you know, says, what about the 1980 Privacy Protection Act? It says that before you can get a search warrant for a reporter going into a house and seizing all these electronic devices, you've got to have probable cause. And what does probable cause say? That requires that you make some finding that the reporter herself or himself has actually engaged in some crime, okay? And the mere fact that you don't like the fact that he or she has gotten this information is not that. The judge says, how could you miss the application of this statute? Again, talking to Department of Justice attorneys, not going well for them. Government's conduct has disturbed the baseline posture of defense of deference, which is also called the presumption of regularity here. And again, the judge says, well, you've got the materials, but tells the FBI extraordinarily that you're not going to be reviewing any of those. I will take a look at all of them. Again, that can happen. It's called an in-camera review, but it's a fairly atypical thing for a judge, himself or herself, to say, I don't trust the government anymore because you haven't followed the law, and also I'm not convinced that even if you're the one who examines what's inside these materials, you'll come up with the right answer here. So again, that's William Porter from Eastern Virginia, basically saying this was done badly. Reporters are in this very special status, as they should be under the First Amendment. No crime can be committed here, crimes that she may be reporting on, but not in her own behavior. Jacob, next slide. This one, boy, I hope we get the text. Okay, we're not getting the text. Sorry, I can tell you what this is. This actually just broke a day or so ago. That is from an event in the fall of last year. And again, I'm going to do this just so I get my notes here a little bit. We have a Navy SEAL operation that has to do with the placement in a coastal area off of North Korea of some surveillance equipment, okay? Obviously, national security issue. And what happens is that very recently, the New York Times discovers this. And once again, the question is whether or not they violated the law in any way. The Department of Justice, once again, subpoenaed the New York Times reporters. This is still pending. Subpoenas them to find out how it is they got this information about this very important national security thing that went on in North Korea. And then final slide, Jacob. This one goes back a little bit. Recall this one, frankly, even before he was sworn in. This is the matter with the Des Moines Register. You may recall that there was a pollster in Iowa who reported that Kamala Harris was beating the candidate, Donald Trump at the time, by a fairly sizable amount of polling numbers, if you will. In the end, he does take Iowa, but not by a huge amount. Donald Trump, again, literally 4 days before the election, begins to complain about that and then files a lawsuit, remember this, against the Des Moines Register, saying that you've engaged in election interference by reporting on a poll. And oh, by the way, I'm also doing this under a commercial statute in the state of Iowa that prohibits this kind of thing. And it talks about it being consumer fraud. That one, believe it or not, bounced around inside Iowa for a while. It's now in a state court. Plainly, at some point, is going to be dismissed. 4 examples, if you will, of this present administration recently and in the past. All of them frivolous lawsuits going after reporters, again, in a way that as late as, again, 4 years ago and even 8 years before that, Department of Justice would never, ever do any of this. We plainly have a president who, once again, is directing the Department of Justice when it comes to issuing subpoenas, going after sources, and trying to figure out who is not being loyal to him. Again, a reference to the First Amendment. Government should not be involved in that kind of conduct. We can take some questions, but Jacob, next slide. And that is, as Kristen said at the outset, we're back here again next week. And if none of that depresses you, just come back for next week. I don't mean that. I don't mean that quite as dramatically as you might think. But we are going to talk, as Kristen said, about the decision Calais and the fact that the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, has all been taken away by the Supreme Court. What that means for gerrymandering, what that means for the future of voting in America. And timely, Kristen and I sort of put this together, not knowing what the decision would be at the time, but timely because, of course, we're in a time of polling, and it is going to affect. I will tell you, some of you heard this already, that I think this and one other case, the most significant two of this term, and it effectively is the third case that the Supreme Court has issued over the period of the past 15 years that basically brings the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to its end. So anticipate that next week. Taking questions, of course, as we always do, but we'll conclude right now just by saying thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Blue Sky, for bringing us all together, and we'll see you next week.